Good evening. This is Gary H. White with the Bay Area chapter of Climate Reality Project. Tonight, I'm going to present on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and COP26, which has just begun in Glasgow. The presentation is entitled, "It's Unequivocal." Now, there was a new IPCC climate report that was just released. And this was the assessment report number 6 that came out in August. Their report assesses existing scientific, technical, and economic information pertaining to climate change. 3 decades have passed since the first report, and since then, global emissions have unfortunately doubled. Given the severity of the report, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls it a code red for humanity. So what is exactly the IPCC? Well, back in 1988, the World Meteorological Organization and the UN Environmental Program created the IPCC to study and report on what was called the greenhouse gas emissions issue. Currently, the organization has 197 members. Scientists come from all over and from all disciplines. It is the authority on the state of knowledge on climate change. Reports are neutral and typically not prescriptive. The reports rely on already existing peer-reviewed climate research that's been done in the past year or few years. And the reports are very, very important for the negotiations that go on at the COP. So in the first report, back in 1990, the publication ushered in what became the Annual Congress of Parties. Authors calculated that CO2 was responsible for over 50% of what was then called the greenhouse effect. They also predicted that under business as usual, the global average temperature would increase by plus 0.3 degrees centigrade through the 21st century. But they were not yet sure if global warming was human-made or was caused by natural Earth cycles. So 5 years later, on assessment report number 2, CO2 remained the most important contributor to global warming. The IPCC confirmed that human activities are altering the climate. And they also determined that many aspects of climate change are now irreversible, though they still lacked an understanding of specific regional effects. And they also stated very substantial cuts in emissions are going to be needed to stabilize these greenhouse gases. 6 years later, in AR number 3, the global temperature had already increased by plus 0.6 degrees centigrade. Scientists were also pointing out that snow cover and glacial ice content were clearly decreasing toward the poles. Emissions due to human activities were continuing to alter the atmosphere. Although confidence in climate models increased, but scientists could not yet simulate all aspects of climate change. But new and stronger evidence that most warming over the past 50 years is due to human activities, and that human influence will continue to alter the atmosphere through the 21st century. Then AR4 in 2007 stated that the warming of the climate system is now clearly occurring. They then stated that most of the warming over the past 50 years is very likely a greater than 90% probability due to human activities. These impacts will very likely increase moving forward. That warming and sea level will rise for decades, and that unmitigated climate change will likely exceed the natural and human systems' ability to adapt. So let's take a look at AR5, released in 2014. It stated that since the 50s, climate changes now are unprecedented, that human influence on the climate is clear. The IPCC now indicated that it is extremely likely, between 95 and 100% probable, that human influence is the dominant cause, and that concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide have increased to levels not seen in the past 800,000 years. They also added that without new policies to mitigate the change, a mean temperature in the year 2100 could be between plus 3.7 to 4.8 degrees centigrade. Now, I'd like to share an interview that was done with Dr. Michael Mann, an American climatologist and geophysicist from Penn State, where he's a distinguished professor of Earth and Material Sciences. This was done a few months ago with MSNBC. Take a look.
All right, so a United Nations panel of scientists released a blistering new report today on the state of our changing climate. They found humans have already pushed our planet into unprecedented territory. Climate change is here, it is accelerating, and it is causing damage that could be irreversible for thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of years to come. Already this year, we have seen devastating floods, unrelenting heat waves, and record-breaking wildfires that have wiped towns completely off the map. The UN Secretary General called this new report a code red for humanity. The question is, will humanity listen? Joining me now is Penn State distinguished Professor Michael Mann. He's director of the Earth System Science Center and author of The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. Michael, thanks for joining us on this. Appreciate it. You joined the show on Friday. You actually said this report was going to be really bad. What is it predicting for the next decade or two as climate change accelerates?
Yeah, thanks, Yasmin. It's good to be with you. And unfortunately, as we watch these tragedies play out in real time, as we've just seen, this wildfire in California that's currently the second largest in California history could become the largest. This is precisely what the report and prior reports said. But this latest report really connects the dots when it comes to climate change and these extreme weather events we're seeing. The heat waves, the wildfires, the floods, the droughts, the superstorms. The report for the first time really, in essence, says we would not be seeing these events if it were not for the warming of the planet caused by fossil fuel burning and the increase in the concentration of these warming greenhouse gases. So the report was written with over the last several years, and yet it is describing precisely what we're seeing play out right now on our television screens.
We're seeing things happen on this macro level, right, Michael? And then on this micro level as well. We saw this devastating flooding happening in Omaha over the weekend. There were folks that were trapped in an elevator. I can't even imagine what it was like to be inside that thing as you saw water rose. It's like being inside of a movie. Luckily, they were okay. But I guess my question is, can we even be ready, right, for what is to come, considering this devastating report and how off guard we have often been caught?
Yeah, and so there are really dual messages in this report. As we've already discussed, dangerous climate change, it isn't some far off threat. It's here. We can see that. So we can't avoid dangerous climate change, but we can prevent it from getting worse. And the report actually lays out the numbers. If we can dramatically move off of fossil fuel burning, bring our carbon emissions down by 50% within the next decade, which is doable, then we can prevent warming beyond a catastrophic 3 degrees Fahrenheit, where we would see far more extensive and far worse extreme weather disasters than we're already seeing, where we really start to test our adaptive capacity to climate change.
All right, how do we do it? And do we need cohesive legislation and cooperation across the globe?
In short, yes. Here in the United States, and we were just talking about that earlier on this program, we need an infrastructure package, but in addition, this reconciliation package where most of the climate legislation is likely to be found. We need that package to pass Congress, which codifies a vast increase in our funding of renewable energy that puts in place things like a clean energy standard that will move us away from fossil fuel burning. We need to get those things in place, because while the current administration, the Biden administration, is really doing everything they can through executive actions, we need those efforts to be codified in terms of legislation. And so all eyes right now are on this reconciliation bill, where there's a potential for the sorts of legislation that will allow us to keep our commitment to the rest of the world to lower our carbon emissions, and by leading, other countries will follow along.
That's the hope, right? But quickly here, I mean, that is legislation that can happen domestically that will have some kind of impact overseas. But what about countries like China and Russia? You think about the skies over Beijing. How is it that those countries cooperate to make sure this goes in the right direction?
Well, China gets it, because they've seen the impact of environmental degradation on their population. It cost them a huge amount of money and health costs. And so they were on the right track. China was decommissioning coal-fired power plants under the Obama administration when there was a bilateral agreement between the two countries. Then the Trump administration came in, said it would no longer honor our obligations. And we saw other countries like China back off in their obligations. Now we're back at the table. Now the United States is once again negotiating with China. It's leading with a bold pledge of its own. The Biden administration has said we're going to cut our carbon emissions by 50% within the next decade. We're going to decarbonize our electricity sector by 2035. That provides some credibility on the world stage when we ask other countries to join and make similar commitments.
I'm hearing.
So that was Michael Mann from Penn State, a prominent climate scientist, and talking about the problems that AR number 6 is highlighting. And so let's go over those. So as I mentioned, it was released in early August of this year. And part 1, the physical science, was the portion that was released thus far. To give you a little bit of background, there were 200 scientific authors that reviewed 14,000 independent, peer-reviewed science papers on climate change. The full report is 4,000 pages long. I don't think anyone outside of the IPCC reads the entire thing, but there are very, very good summaries that point out the key findings from the organization. The key takeaway, though, is that the scientists in this report state it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, the oceans, and the land. And what that means is that humans can release only another 500 gigatons of carbon emissions. We've released 2,400 gigatons to date. If we do that, only 500 more, we have a 50-50 chance of stabilizing warming at plus 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is our target. They also point out that most of the world's wealthiest countries are still ill-prepared for escalating climate impacts. Not enough adaptation has occurred. Additionally, they point out that the likely warming range now of doubling CO2 to 560 ppm is now plus 2.5 to 4.0 centigrade, with a 2.9 degree target, and we are now at 420 ppm. They highlight that every fraction of a degree of warming that we prevent helps us stabilize the climate at a safer level. So we don't only look at whole numbers of +1, +2, +3, but fractions of numbers as well, because that's very, very important. They state that every region of the planet now is expected to experience worsening climate impacts. We're already seeing that. And that further warming will likely trigger tipping points. And one of those tipping points is the complete melting of the Arctic, where once human contribution to climate change is suspended, this might be able to happen and continue on its own momentum. They also urge funding of mitigation and adaptation now, or we'll pay a higher price in the future. And here you can see a number of headlines from some periodicals and newspapers. New Yorker states the UN's terrifying climate report. The Atlantic, it's grim. Grist, a climate webzine, the IPCC's latest climate report is dire. The colorful newspapers on the right are papers from the UK, which highlight the severity of this as well. So with part one already released, we will wait for IPCC 6 parts 2 and 3. Parts 2 will be the impacts, and part 3 will be mitigation strategies, which will be coming out in the next few months. Now, Extinction Rebellion scientists in Spain were actually responsible for leaking a draft of part 3 mitigation to the press very recently. And they've discovered that this is the first time an assessment report will be prescriptive, i.e. they will tell the world what their recommendation is to be able to lower carbon content. They point out that the emissions must peak in the next 4 years and then drop, as we've mentioned, by 50% by the year 2030, that no new fossil fuel infrastructure can be built. They encourage a transition to plant-based diets, and that we must lower the amount of air travel because it's very, very polluting and releases a lot of greenhouse gas. So what about COP? What is COP? Well, COP stands for Conference of the Parties. It's the supreme decision-making body of the Climate Convention. All parties that are at the convention are represented. Documents and decisions on international climate issues are reviewed. Agreements between the nations, as occurred at COP21 in Paris in 2015, can only come by a complete full consensus of every country. The assessment reports that we just went over loom large in informing negotiations. The COPs meet every year unless the parties decide otherwise, which in fact happened last year due to the pandemic. COP26 was supposed to happen in 2020. It's now happening in 2021, and the location rotates among the world. Now, here are a few key dates in COP history. They started in 1995 in Berlin. Probably the most important early COP was in 1997 in Kyoto, Japan, when the Kyoto Protocol was passed. And then I would point out the 2015 COP21 in Paris, where the Paris Climate Agreement was reached, which was a huge milestone, and now COP26 in Glasgow, UK. So what can we anticipate with this COP, which is starting as we speak? Well, it'll be for the first 2 weeks of November. 20,000 people are expected to attend. As I mentioned, it was rescheduled from 2020. And the goals are as follows: secure global net zero by 2050 and keep 1.5 degrees centigrade within reach, promote adaptation, deliver it at least the $100 billion per year the Paris Agreement had agreed upon to poor countries for adaptation, and to work together as a world community on solving the climate crisis moving forward. John Kerry, who is the climate czar for President Biden right now, as you know, has a quote about it and said, COP26 is the world's last best chance to avoid ecological calamity. And activist Bill McKibben said once before, the world will convert to renewable energy. The question is, will it be in time? So a few details of COP26. The first week of the 2 weeks will be technical negotiation. The second week, high-level ministerial and head of state meetings. You can see the photos on the bottom. On the left is Alok Sharma, who is the COP26 president, former member of the UK Parliament. In the middle is Patricia Espinosa of Mexico. She is the executive secretary of the UNFCCC. And lastly, Mark Carney is attending as the UK Prime Minister's financial advisor for COP26. Now, there are many, many challenges at COP26 that are going to have to be addressed. First and foremost, from the US perspective, is that Biden's Build Back Better Reconciliation Act is still not passed. There is a lot of negotiation still going on. Unfortunately, a lot of climate action has been whittled out of the original proposed $3.5 trillion plan. And we are hoping that that gets passed by Congress very, very soon. Another challenge is getting every nation to submit tougher climate goals. One of the precepts of the Paris Agreement in 2015 was that every 5 years, nations would update their nationally determined goals to make them more aggressive. That still needs to happen. Another is addressing the transparency of climate achievements to make sure that nations' achievements can be checked and verified. Also, standardizing the counting of climate achievements is really important so as to not double count these effects. And then also, as I alluded to, delivering on the agreed upon $100 billion per year financial fund for developing nations, while the developing nations recently are now claiming the need for $1 trillion for climate adaptation. So we'll have to see how that unfolds. So what role can you play during and beyond COP26? Well, one thing that is always very, very important is to be in touch with office holders, and in this case, national ones. So write letters, email President Biden, or contact Secretary Kerry and express your concern about climate change and your desire to see the Reconciliation Act passed. You can give this slideshow presentation to groups you belong to. The slides will be on the chapter's website. Look for them. You can promote climate justice. You can lobby your city to pass what are called REACH codes to phase out natural gas in homes. You can pressure your company, if you're still working, to adopt more aggressive sustainability practices. And last but not least, and most importantly, you can take to the streets to demand systemic climate action. So let me show you one final video that was put together by the COP26 committee in the UK. The time is now.
The future I'd like to see is a future where everybody works together.
In Glasgow, we are looking for action.
Hamid office is Hamid Correction, Gymnasium Glasgow Guyana.
Everyone needs to step up. It's all our responsibilities.
Speak up for what's right.
Action has to be taken now.
It is possible for everyone to make a difference.
Bring your A game to Glasgow.
that we cannot ever win only by talking.
There is no doubt that we all can make a difference.
The biggest responsibility lies on decision makers.
Together we can fight this.
Saya di sini.
I'm ready.
I'm ready.
Di atas kaki.
我准备好了。I'm ready.
Saya siap.
还没举手。
So that concludes my presentation. I hope you found it informative, learned about the IPCC and the newest assessment report number 6, and got a feeling for and understood the challenges with COP26. So continue the fight to address climate change in all that you do. Good night.